So today we attempt to complete our review of Module 3 concepts, specifically about cyber law and ethics. We wanted to get some specific details down about the cybersecurity laws and precedent, the important milestones. One of the very first was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It was passed in 1986, went into effect in 1986, and immediately was engaged to put someone in jail for the creation of one of the first computer worms to afflict the early internet. It was called the Morris worm. A graduate student from one of the Ivy League schools had devised some malicious code, and it turned loose and started spreading and infecting other systems, to include some federally funded computer systems. And the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act makes it illegal, makes it a felony if you hack federal information systems. And so this was very early in the process in computer history. So has anyone ever heard of the Morris worm? The Morris computer worm?
Nope.
No. Has anyone ever heard of industrial espionage?
Industrial espionage, yeah.
Yes. So in the study guide, we talk about the European Union and the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. That's kind of the equivalent of some of our cyber laws, but there's actually a pretty cool thing. There was a law that was passed called the High Tech Act, which is intended to thwart or to decrease the amount of industrial espionage that was going on. Much of our hacking is motivated out of commercial interests. And in fact, there's a really cool thing here about the Boeing black phone. So this is a significant milestone because Boeing, is everybody familiar with Boeing Jet or Boeing Aerospace?
Yeah.
Okay. So Boeing has been a huge defense contractor, but also a global aerospace contractor. Most of our jets, many of our jets, they're a multinational corporation, and essentially they provide many of the world's airliners. Well, the Chinese were interested in getting a leg up on the competition, and their aerospace industry needed some help. So the Chinese government got involved with a member of the army. So the Red Army is home to some of the most skilled hackers on the planet. In fact, Advanced Persistent Threat number 1 is a member of the Chinese Red Army, the People's Army. And essentially, when Boeing was developing one of its latest models, within a few short months after Boeing started marketing their new plane, the Chinese came out with an identical airliner. And when I say identical, I mean down to the parts, in the engines, in the passenger compartment, right? Everything was, if you put them side by side, they were undistinguishable. Boeing got pretty tired of this. And of course, there's been a lot of industrial espionage. Now, this doesn't just happen with the Chinese. The Europeans have been involved in industrial espionage, stolen trade secrets, new developments for their own purposes. So they can do things quicker and cheaper and get to market before the competition. The Boeing Black Phone was something that was developed because what they wanted to do was create something that was secure, since so many special developments and much of their research and development was lost. So they worked with the United States government to create an Android phone where there's nothing in it. And when it's turned on, the phone downloads a secure, sterile version of the Android operating system, right? So there's nothing on the phone itself. And when the phone is turned on, it connects to the internet, downloads a brand new copy of uninfected operating system, including all of the apps. And then after it's used and it's turned off, it basically blows up. It self-destructs down to the bare metal again, so that the phone is completely emptied after its use. So as soon as it's turned off, nothing is left on the phone. It's just a device with no data whatsoever. And the whole idea was to produce something that couldn't be hacked, right? So the whole idea was they would produce a device that could keep communications and data secure, and then in that manner, every time it was used, the phone would not keep any of the data or the operating system. So that was just something that would be fun to share. So as we left our last session, we were talking about tort. When you hear the word tort, what common legal trouble do you equate with the word tort and civil law? What's happening when somebody invokes civil law and tort? What are they doing? Didn't we cover this? It said they're suing somebody. Does that ring a bell? Hello?
Yeah, it rings a bell. Sorry.
Yes. Usually when you're dealing with civil law and tort, that means there's a contract that's been broken and somebody's being sued. So when you talk about lawsuits, that's tort law and civil, right? Let's talk about other kinds of criminal law, right? So the United States has been a leader in the development and implementation of cybersecurity law, with the exception of the European Union. Now, the European Union has a very effective GDPR we just mentioned. And so when you have effective cybersecurity law from the legislature and they pass laws, you have more reliable business environment and a stable economy. And so the US has demonstrated how to do this well. They're considered to be a role model for other nations to emulate. Now, that said, there are some notable challenges along the way, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Just understand that we're talking about lawsuits and we're also talking about criminal. So we mentioned the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for federal information systems, right? And the National Information Infrastructure Protection Act. So that's National Information Infrastructure Protection, 1996, 10 years later. So it supplemented and strengthened the original law in 1986. There was a second round of this. The Patriot Act of 2001, we did talk about that, yes?
Yeah.
And then we said that there were some challenges because it was abused. So there was a Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act, which still allows the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI to investigate terrorists So even though there were setbacks, they revamped or restructured the Patriot Act so that when it comes to terrorism or acts of terrorism, the U.S. government can still monitor digital communications and data, right? The USA Freedom Act inherited some of the USA Patriot functions. So the Patriot Act itself expired in 2015. If we ask ourselves, is the Patriot Act still in effect? No. It's now known as the USA Freedom Act. Okay. So we're preserving the cause of freedom and protecting against terrorism. The Computer Security Act of 1987 is one of the first attempts, right? It establishes minimal acceptable security practices. So on your assessment, if you're asked which federal law, occurred at what time to establish minimum acceptable security practices, things like logins with passwords, right? 1987. So one of the first laws was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which made it unlawful to hack systems. But then 1 year later, the Security Act said, oh, and we should also be doing these secure things. So right on the heels of that, 86 and 87, those are two really important milestones. FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, was enacted in 2002, and there's an updated version now. It's called FISMA Reform. It basically required federal agencies to improve and to establish intentionally establish information security programs and to coordinate how responses to security attacks are conducted when that happens with government agencies and departments. So the response component of cybersecurity came along in 2014, but in 2002, all of the federal government agencies said, okay, we got to get serious about protecting our computing systems. That's not too long ago when you think about it. Any questions so far? Has anyone ever heard of FISMA before?
Oh, first time.
First time, okay. If you work with the US government or you accept federal financial, if you accept federal funding for any purpose, there are many requirements that the government mandates for federal information systems and data protection, and those also apply to anybody who's tied in to federal resources. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize. So this is a really important aspect of the federal laws and statutes, is that if you're accepting federal funds, then many of the requirements and mandates for federal information security in the agencies also apply to you. Now, do you think is it true or not true the U.S. Virgin Islands government receives federal funding? Is that true?
That's true.
Well, I'm sorry, what was that again?
I will say that's true.
That is true. And so there are requirements that the VI territorial government have to honor and abide by because they receive funding from the U.S. federal government. Privacy is a whole nother aspect of cyber law. So when we're talking about criminal law, that's one thing. But when we're talking about privacy, there are federal laws that protect the privacy of individuals and their data, right? This is a really important slide right here. Slide number 16, and we actually mentioned that in our study guide. So this is a principle that's really significant. When you have different data sources, each of those data sources by themselves, taken apart from all the other information sources you may have, the one source by itself may not be considered sensitive information or private information. However, because of the way that computers work and how they're all connected together, one of the most important principles to understand now about law is that if data on different systems is combined or accessed for a given purpose, that organizational data and all of that combined suddenly becomes sensitive information. So here's an example. If let's ask if I had access to someone's birth date and all I had was information about, let's talk about the US Virgin Islands. How many residents are there in the US Virgin Islands? Let's use a quick example. What's our current population? Anybody know? Okay, 99.1 thousand, right? 99,100 people, according to the January 2023 statistics. So let's say we have 100,000 people in the US Virgin Islands, and I have data that identifies nothing else. Okay, let's say I were able to download a study that was conducted on vital records and statistics. Oh, look at that. The US Census and vital records and statistics would have information on the birth dates of people in the population. Now, to make things easy, let's just say that we have 100,000 people, okay, in the islands, including visitors, on any given day. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
And let's pretend that I have birth dates and the sex of, or the marital status of the individual, okay? Birth dates and marital status. Would I be able to identify a specific individual if all I had was birth dates and marital status? What do you think?
You could probably narrow it down, but there might be two people that have the same birthday and they're both married. So it'd be, you'd lower the amount of people to look at, but you probably wouldn't find the person you're looking for immediately.
That's right. You couldn't identify them specifically. Now, what happens if we add a little more information, right? That's where information aggregation occurs. What's the tipping point? Let's say we add their race. That narrows it down further still, doesn't it? Let's say we add their zip code. That furthers it down even still, right? You get where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Yep. So data taken by itself from different sources may not be sensitive or private, but the moment you start combining information to where, okay, now I'm on an automated computer system and I can what? Write some software? Join some data tables? That's all it takes. It doesn't take anything to join two data tables and all of a sudden, uh-oh, now I've got all of this information and now I can do a simple query. I can use some SQL statements. I can narrow it down to one or two people. And then with any other piece of information, I got them. I know exactly who I'm talking about. This concept of information aggregation is critical because most people don't believe that the stuff on their phone or on their laptop or on their Facebook page or on their Twitter or elsewhere, right? their TikTok, that just the one source of information is a problem. But when you're a hacking target, hackers aren't going to look at just one source of information about you. And that's the catch. You have to think like the adversary to understand dynamics about the laws and requirements and statutes, right? So we do have some privacy law. The first and most important has to do with the Federal Privacy Act of 1974. Before we ever had computers, we've mentioned this before, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, that has to do with email. HIPAA has to do with health records. Here's Financial Services Modernization Act. Another name for this is GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. You have to have financial safeguards and protect financial data. That's what this one means in 1999. Now, which of the following is another name for the Financial Services Modernization Act? GLBA, right? The High-Tech Act has to do with espionage, right? What about Kennedy-Kassebaum Act? What is that? Anybody know what that is? I believe that might be HIPAA. That might be another name for HIPAA. So if you look up the Wikipedia for HIPAA, I think Kennedy-Kassebaum. Yes. So those were the two senators, I think, that, or legislators that sponsored this. So another name for HIPAA is Kennedy-Kassebaum. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
Don't let that fool you. All right, let's keep going. By the way, we did tell you that we do not have class on Wednesday, correct? Have we mentioned that?
I don't think you mentioned it, but I think most of us know already.
Okay. Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion about whether that happens on Friday or on Wednesday, but it is Wednesday, so we will not be meeting. The campus will be closed on Wednesday. Identity theft can occur, right, when someone steals a victim's personally identifiable information. So identity theft is one of the primary consequences, right? And that happens when the consolidation of personal data starts to happen. So oftentimes when identity is stolen, the hackers are getting information about your birthday from one source, and then information about your marital status from another source, and information about your employment from yet another source. Once they have enough personally identifiable information, they can pose as the victim to make purchases. In fact, one of the most common methods for hacking is to impersonate. It's their stock in trade. A hacker has to impersonate at some point in order to be effective. It's a common thread. And we're going to emphasize that over and over and over again. I want you to understand that impersonating someone is illegal. All right. I mean, there's laws against it. Federal Trade Commission oversees efforts to foster coordination, effective prosecution of criminals, and methods to increase victims' restitution. So who is the federal agency that's involved when identity theft occurs? The Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. Now, the Federal Trade Commission is an agency that's it's a smaller agency within the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so that's an important understanding. The U.S. Department of Commerce is home to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the FTC, and the Better Business Bureau, right? Has anyone ever heard of the Better Business Bureau?
Yeah, I've heard of it before.
Yeah, actually, that's a joke. The Better Business Bureau is it's an independent organization, and they help establish fair business practices. So they're kind of like a trade organization, but they're not associated with the federal government. So if I try to trick you on the assessment by saying that the Better Business Bureau works with the Federal Trade Commission to prosecute identity theft, that would not be an accurate statement. But I do want you to understand the connection. See, fair trade and better business is really kind of related when you think about it. This is the federal strong arm that makes that happen. Fraud and related activity in connection with identification documents. When there's impersonation, right? Title 18 of the, whenever you see USC, that stands for US Code, and that symbol means Section 1028. These are laws that were passed under Title 18 legislation, US Code, Section 1028. That's often how you see specific laws represented. That's true for many of the laws we've just talked about. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, HIPAA, all these others. You'll see references to US Code section such and such, okay? So there are other ways to represent the many different laws. The thing to remember about the FTC is that it has to do with day-to-day business. And the most common crime that's committed is identity theft, because somebody's taking advantage of your finances in order to dupe or trick others into spending money, and then they make off with the goods, right? So if you suspect that you've been victimized by identity theft, it's really important to understand the next steps you ought to take. The first thing you want to do is report that you believe you have a problem to one of the 3 national credit reporting companies. Does anyone know what those companies are? Has anyone ever heard about the national credit reporting companies?
Maybe I have. I'm not sure. Not sure.
So there are 3 credit bureaus: Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. And the reason it's important to understand this is, let's pretend you suspect that something weird is starting to happen, some strange bills start showing up, and you've heard that you have some debts outstanding in the community, and you're like, I don't shop at that store. If you go to Experian or Equifax or TransUnion and you look up your own personal information, they all have information on the credit accounts, bank accounts, and financial instruments that have been opened in your name. Let's say that again. If you ever wanted to know how you can look up whether somebody's doing something by impersonating you, you go here and you look yourself up. And if you find that in the last 2 weeks, you've just opened 2 bank accounts and a new credit card, the next question is, okay, where the hell are those being mailed? Because I'm not getting them in my mailbox. This is the first step that you take. You report and you check on yourself. And this is what every citizen of the United States of America can and should be doing. If you get a notice and you see in the newspaper, oh, the data was hacked in this government agency, everybody should check in. If they have data in that government agency, everybody should check in with those 3: Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. You should check and see. You also get your credit rating. Has anyone ever checked your own credit rating? Did you know you can order credit reports on yourself and they're free?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Okay.
if you have a credit rating like 700 and you check it 6 months later and now your credit rating is 500, and you haven't done anything, it's time to check to see, okay, what accounts have been opened. You can create, now after you check that, if you find suspicious activity, you can create an identity theft report. And what that does is it serves notice to your financial institutions, and it's also used to file a police report, so that basically you can start notifying people, hey, I have a problem. Now, if you don't do that, sometimes, depending on the credit card or the account, you can be responsible for the money that's spent. Let me say that again. If you don't take action when it's obvious that there's a problem, if you don't file a report and start notifying people, they can come after you and insist you pay for it because you're not helping their case. And somebody made off with lots of their money, right? Does everybody understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we talked about the High-Tech Act, but there was another legislation, there was another law that was passed in 1996. So if you think of the High-Tech Act, that's one. And then the other one is the Economic Espionage Act of 1996 and the Safety and Freedom Through Encryption Act. So requiring encryption helped prevent a lot of espionage and a lot of hacking. So the idea that we're improving security and we're improving the free access to safe information, right? It just made sense. So there's a law that says when it comes to certain information, it has to be encrypted. If you've ever wondered about that, that's the law that counts. So that's a good one to know. Oh, and it also says you're prohibited from selling encryption algorithms. So encryption algorithms are considered to be like trade secrets, and in some cases even weapons, because if an enemy gets a hold of an encryption algorithm and they use it, they can operate in clandestine ways, and then nobody knows what's going on. We're kind of in a blackout condition. So encryption algorithms are considered to be very highly sensitive information. And if you export those, have you ever wondered how some tech can't be sent to the US Virgin Islands, and they say, well, you're outside the US, so we can't send this tech to you by Amazon because, well, there are restrictions. They don't want that technology to get in the hands of others while it's on its way here. There are penalties for using encryption technology. Everybody's aware of copyright laws. We've talked about that before, right?
Yeah.
You have intellectual property, so you have the Fraud and Abuse Act. Everybody knows what a trademark is, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can't steal a trademark. And most people know what a copyright is. How about a trade secret? Would a trade secret be considered intellectual property? And would trade secrets be protected under intellectual property law?
I don't think so, because for intellectual properties, don't you have to like outwardly like say, okay, this is mine? And if it's a secret, you can't really say it's yours since it's a secret.
Well, in a manner of speaking, a trade secret is information that allows you to do business like no one else. Now, here's this first example, right? Coca-Cola. They've worked very hard to keep how they make Coca-Cola a secret. And it is a trade secret, and it is protected as intellectual property. Because the way that Coca-Cola is made, it can be protected under patent law. Have you heard of patents?
Yeah.
Right. So an ideas cannot be patented, but inventions can, and methods can. And if there's a method to making Coca-Cola, if it's been patented properly, it's protected. So the important thing to understand is trade secrets can be important proprietary and sensitive information. And if it's properly protected, it's covered under law, right? So if there's a process to manufacturing an iPhone that's different from any other process and it's patented, then that's protected, right? Now, it says intellectual property includes all of the following except. Which of these do you think is public domain and which do you think are protected under copyright or patent or trade secret law? Has anyone ever heard of the term public domain?
Yeah.
So after a time, an artistic work like a copyrighted book, it's no longer protected under copyright. And it can be distributed under public domain, right? Which means that the copyright is no longer, it's only good for so many years. Copyrights and patents are only good for so many years. Did you know that the color TV was actually invented in the late 1920s? But TVs didn't exist anywhere until the early 50s. That's because the patent for the color TV was filed by a guy named Farlow Farnsworth. And there was a company called RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, and they had a lock on radios. They sold radios to everybody. This was in the early 20s and 30s. They knew that when the TV came out, everybody would want TVs. So what they did was they bribed a lot of people and they stonewalled Farlow Farnsworth until his patent expired. And then they produced the TVs. They basically stonewalled him and shut him down. They did economic things to keep him from going to market with his invention in the 20s and 30s. Of course, that wasn't hard to do because the Great Depression hit in the late 1920s, and then the markets were all kind of shot anyway for a while. This is also an important thing. In order for cybersecurity to work, corporations have to report things accurately. They have to report their financial data, and it has to be credible financial data. This is called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. So data about the financial information of your corporation, it's required that that's reported properly, and it has to be accurate, reliable information. Now, when you think about cybersecurity, modifying or altering data is a problem, isn't it? I mean, if you modify data and it's unauthorized corruption of the data, that's literally an act of sabotage when you think about it. Companies that intentionally cook the books or report inaccurate information are quite literally conducting illegal cybersecurity activities because they're corrupting the authentic data of the financial activities of the corporation to hide things from their stockholders or from the markets or from the government, and that's illegal. So this is another law that has significant ties to cybersecurity, and it doesn't seem that way up front. But if your reporting for the finances of your company is scrambled egg, you can go to jail for that, right? Freedom of Information Act. Has anyone ever heard of the Freedom of Information Act?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Okay, so the US government says that, okay, in addition to encryption and all these other things, there is some data and some information that the US government is required to provide to its citizens. And so this is the flip side of most cyber law has to do with things you can't do or shouldn't do. But this is one cyber law in particular. It's a favorite of mine, and it's been around a long time, 1966. You can request the US government provide you with information and they have to do it, right? But it doesn't apply to state or local government agencies or private businesses and individuals. So that's one thing to remember. At this point, we'll stop here and we'll pick up on Friday. I hope you enjoy the holiday on Wednesday. Please finish the solution for Module 3 if you haven't been in there yet. If you need access or you need to go back in there, we'll go ahead and update the access document so you can request a day and time. Are there any observations, comments, or questions before we close today?